Chapter 6. After the sudden gunfire and commotion, the camp had taken on the aura of post-war calm, tense as the eye of a hurricane. The blasts and explosions had frightened all wildlife away, or into silence, and the pulse of the jungle was weirdly flat in the oppressive heat of the late afternoon. Gazing around the palapa, Schaefer silently observed heaps of helmets and battle gear and crate loads of ammunition by the score. For the first time, he was able to study the methodically warehoused interior of the cavernous chamber, the enormous stockpiles of weapons and equipment. It was obviously a major military stronghold, doubly so to be so deep in the mountains. It had taken weeks and a lot of money to cart all of this shit in. They had enough combat supplies in here to level Brazil. As he finished a cursory inventory and headed up the steps to the clearing, he wondered why they had centralized such a reservoir of sophisticated equipment. He figured most of it was stolen from the ship's cargoes en route to opposing armies, or bartered from shaky Third World regimes that supported the attempted takeover. But already he realized that there had to be a reason, a highly explosive reason, to go to all this trouble to arm a camp in the middle of nowhere. Even as he absorbed the evidence, his instincts began to shiver with suspicions he couldn't yet identify or explain. But as he threw back the curtain and stepped out into the clearing, Dylan came to mind with a sour taste. He filed another red flag as Mac jogged over to him. "Any sign of the hostages?" Schaefer inquired with narrowed eyes. Mac was agitated. "We found all three of them, Major. Dead." He pointed across the clearing to one of the huts. "The gear from the chopper too. Listen, if those guys are Central American, I'm a fucking Chinaman. By the look of them, I'd say CIA." Schaefer's eyes were like slits as he darted a look at Dylan, who huddled over the radio next to Hawkins, trying to shout their coordinates. "Oh, another thing, Major," Mac added. "We got lucky. Couple of these guys we waxed are Russians. Got their transport papers right in their hip pocket. Some kind of counter-espionage unit. There was major shit about to get going here." As Schaefer listened to Mac's casual speculations, his face began to tighten and redden with anger. The fragmented image of his vague suspicions began to take shape. But still, he kept his thoughts to himself, not revealing a glimmer of a reaction to Mac's brute irony. "Good work, Mac," he said brusquely. "Clear the area, no traces. Then get the men ready to move." Blaine had been nosing among the flattened huts, and now he whistled to the Major, hailing Schaefer with the wave of an arm. "Now what?" Schaefer thought grimly as he stepped around Dylan and Hawkins hunched at the edge of the radio and crossed through the blasted wreckage of the huts. Blaine was pointing his cocked rifle at the inert form of a gorilla who lay in the twisted thatchwork. The enemy wore fatigues and a cap that hid most of his face, but even the hard army clothes didn't hide the fact that this Contra was hardly out of his mid-teens. It crossed Schaefer's mind, as it had in Indochina. Kids did the dying in hopeless wars. "He's still breathing," Blaine said flatly, as unsentimental about enemy kids as he was about everything else. Blaine's world was good guys and bad guys. There were no good bad guys. Schaefer waved him away, then pulled out his revolver. Carefully, he rolled out the chamber, and with the swift technique of a combat vet, he filled it with 6 lead bullets. Then he knelt beside the enemy soldier. This kid, he was thinking, might have some answers his captains didn't even know, if he could be revived. Schaefer lifted the boy's hand to check for a pulse. It was oddly a narrow hand with long tapered fingers, delicate yet strong. The Major's eyes moved up to the face, now visible under the cap. The face of a girl. Probably in her mid-20s, her hair tied back and tucked under the cap, she looked lost in the loose-fitting fatigues. Because of the clothes, and with her cheeks streaked with dirt and blood, it was no wonder Blaine hadn't noticed her gender. Schaefer stared at her intently, as if he couldn't make this fit with the 3 bodies flayed and hanging from the tree, even though he had seen children toss bombs and run away laughing. She was beautiful, with a tawny complexion and thick black hair. She had a strong, narrow face, the jaw tight, and the sensuous mouth pouting defiantly. Even as she lay unconscious, he could see the rebellious spirit in her expression. The haughty romantic, the angry commitment to the cause, would be there when she awoke, he knew. Schaefer was well aware that for a woman to be on active duty in the top rebel force in this chauvinistic, Catholic backwater of a country, where the men really did keep their women barefoot and pregnant, this had to be one extraordinarily talented and well-connected lady. As much as he despised the barbaric tactics and the inhuman style of the rebels, he had to smile a little here, as if with a momentary glint of respect. Her pulse was stable. He pulled off the cap and turned her head. Apparently she had been knocked unconscious by the falling roof of the hut, but there was no evidence of serious injury other than a nasty head gash. She'd be all right. As an automatic precaution, he picked up the pistol she dropped at her side and ejected the magazine. Then, with a hunger for some answers, he began to rummage through papers scattered in the wreckage around her, impatient for information about the place he had just destroyed. Frustrated and tired, he tossed the irrelevant sheets of paper back on the ground. Lists of supplies in Spanish, newspapers, propaganda leaflets. Then suddenly he paused at one torn page in his hand and began reading intently. It was a form he couldn't translate entirely, but one he knew the meaning of immediately. It was orders to launch a major offensive on the Contamana capital, to level the city if need be. No prisoners, mass execution. Schaefer had seen the same kind of combat orders in 5 different languages. People always blew their country up in words that fit on a single page. And according to the documents, the whole offensive was to begin in just 3 days. The pieces began to fall together. Suddenly Schaefer realized he was standing at the epicenter of the guerrillas' pivotal invasion tactic. The war that had been just skirmishes and incidents, pipe bombs thrown in alleys, peasants disappeared, was about to become a full-scale conflagration on the international scale. The tough guy munitions and radar equipment littered the jungle camp like the remnants of a lost culture that prayed to a deaf god. Before Schaefer and his men had barreled in, it was all poised to stream through the jungle towards a final battle. It was clear as day now. Philip's so-called mission to rescue 3 politicos was a ruse to manipulate Schaefer and his men to block the rebel invasion. Dillon, Phillips, the full fucking Central Command, they all must have gotten wind of the plan before Schaefer was ever summoned. Oh yes, Schaefer was going to get some answers now. And then he would cram them down everyone's throat, all the way from here to Langley. Ramirez moved lightly among the rubber trees, chasing a bunch of rebels who'd managed to escape. They were so sloppy in their scramble to retreat that they left a trail a Girl Scout could have followed. The moss was torn and the lower branches trampled. One of the guerrillas had dropped a revolver by the stump of a tree, as if even weapons were a burden now. These last survivors of the camp just wanted out. Maneuvering through a thicket, Ramirez emerged into a small clearing. At the far edge was a sheer cliff, shooting up about 50 feet, with a trickle of water trailing scum across the face of the rock. At the top was a ledge, which trailed off to another level of jungle. As Ramirez approached the dead-end spot at the base of the cliff, he could see that the rock was hollowed out here and there with shallow caves, and trails of moss and slime half obscuring the openings. Suddenly, he noticed movement above, and he ducked behind an outcropping of rock, just as the echoing zing of bullets careened off the ground around him. One of the bullets grazed his upper arm as he leaped for the protection of a larger boulder. From there, he could see that at least 2 guerrillas had taken cover in the cliff hollows. As one of them crouched to reload, thinking Ramirez was down, the commando took aim and returned fire. He clipped the guerrilla on the side of the head before he could duck into the cave. The rebel screamed once, then toppled backwards down the rock face, hitting the mossy ground below, about 5 feet from Ramirez. The Chicano hastily crossed himself, thinking as he stared into the dead man's eyes how they could have been cousins. Ramirez didn't like killing brown men, not unless they lived in the Middle East. The other rebel was still holed up in a higher cave with better protection. With the advantage of elevation over Ramirez, he was able to keep the commando pinned behind the boulder with minimum fire. The feisty Chicano quickly shook his brotherly feelings. He hated being treated like a cornered rat. Just then, Blaine broke through the underbrush, hesitating before he entered the clearing. Ramirez, making eye contact, motioned to the dead man, then up above to the enemy, alerting his buddy so he wouldn't stumble into a downpour of bullets. Then he made a beckoning motion, indicating he would cover Blaine so that the latter could join him behind the boulder. Knowing the rebel would hunker down in the cave under rapid fire, Ramirez opened up, making the trails of moss dance along the cliff face and giving Blaine the precious seconds to run to his side. Right away, Ramirez noticed Blaine's torn and bloody shirt. "You shithead, you're hit! You're bleeding all over me, man!" "Goddamn grenade blew while I was covering Billy," the big man explained, glancing down at the caking blood. "Anyway, I ain't got time to bleed." He was right about the time. Half a second later, a grenade exploded a few feet away, blowing a leg off the dead rebel. A round of automatic fire followed. The spray of dirt coughed up was as thick as a Saigon mudstorm. As the grit settled on the two commandos, Ramirez quickly replaced the 40mm rounds in his six-shooter. Then he leaped over the boulder and threw himself into the line of fire. "Come back here, you stupid spick!" shouted Blaine. Ramirez blasted 6 rapid-fire rounds on a high-arc trajectory towards the enemy cave above. Then, just as quick as he went, he scrambled back to the protection of the rock, squatting next to Blaine. "We call that a Tijuana yo-yo," he said, then grinned as he popped his fingers into his ears. Blaine grimaced and ducked his head, just as the whole cliffside exploded. An instant later, enormous chunks of rock rumbled down like meteorites. Then a torrent of vegetation rained down on their heads, mixed with the dying screams of several rebels holed up in the cliff. For a few long seconds, nothing was visible but the avalanche of shredded jungle matter pouring into the vortex. The stream on the rock face spewed like a broken hose. Then a dead calm followed, like a windless sea, and the jungle froze. For half a mile around, nothing made a peep. Then Blaine's voice rose from the wreckage. "You stupid spick," he crowed, but this time it was a cry of triumph. Schaefer still stood by the unconscious woman, his weapon hanging slack from one arm, the telling paper clenched in his fingers as if it were the pivotal evidence in a sensational trial. Except here in the jungle, there was neither judge nor jury, and the only law that worked lay crouched in the bush, ready to spring for the throat. Dutch stared silently fuming at the ruined huts. He didn't notice the black man moving towards him, poking at the ground for classified stuff. Dylan scarcely looked at the girl as he knelt and began sorting through the papers that Schaefer had already scoured. Dutch made no attempt to tell him he was wasting his time. He simply watched the back of the black man's head for a long moment, trying to remember exactly where it was in Indochina that he'd felt the blood bond for his comrade. Sometimes the countries just seemed to blur, dirty and thick with flies, the sick whores and the rotten politicians, the wars that went on for decades. Dylan broke the silence. "We did it, Dutch! We did it!" he said excitedly, methodically sorting through stacks of paper. He might have been sitting at his desk at that moment. Every scrap of paper seemed to have meaning to him, even the bills for printing the anti-governmental posters. "This is beautiful," he exclaimed. "More than we expected. We got the bastards cold." Schaefer crouched, leaned across the body of the unconscious girl, and handed Dylan the one sheet he had culled from the mess. "Hey pal, I think this is the one you're looking for," said the Major, with a steely edge. Dylan took the paper and read intently, his eyes widening. 3 days, that's all we had," he said, with a shake of his head. "Not a fucking minute to waste, Dutch. In 3 days, you'd have had hundreds of these geeks in here, equipped up the ass," he added, sweeping his hand and taking in the entire routed camp. "Once they crossed the border, they would have been home free. It'd take a year to stop them." Dylan put a solemn hand on Schaefer's shoulder and continued sanctimoniously. "You guys have averted a major rebel invasion, Dutch. They're going to know about this all the way to the big house, I promise you. Schaefer stood abruptly, throwing off Dylan's hand. His eyes narrowed, his nostrils flared, and he stared defiantly into the black man's face. Venom seethed through his words. It was all bullshit, all of it, right from the start, huh? You set us up, he sneered. Brought us in here to fight your dirty little non-partisan war. I guess you're what we'd call technical advisors. Ain't that the polite word for it? Or have you figured out something even better? Something that makes your shit smell real clean, right? You fucking son of a bitch. Dylan retorted angrily. Hey, give me a break, Dutch. So the company has set you up. Who do you believe in? The Easter Bunny? We had a goddamn good reason. You're the best there is, Dutch. I needed you. Why the fuck didn't you just tell me what was going on? Dylan shrugged. It was the shrug of every bureaucrat the world over. Couldn't, Dutch. Had little blue tags all over it. National security. White House only. I didn't even know about all the details myself till I was on the plane. They asked me who could take out a guerrilla camp, and I said, you guys. I had to give you a cover story, orders right from the Oval Office. Swear to God, Dutch. Remind me to pledge allegiance next time we pass a flag. You got a right to be pissed. I'm not saying you don't. Oh, that's real sporting of you, pal. And one other thing. What kind of story did you tell Jack Davis? Dylan winced, recalling the 3 horribly mutilated men they'd found earlier. Dutch, you've got to understand. We've been trying to find this place for months. Davis was sent up to pull the CIA guys once they had a fix on the camp. He volunteered for the job. But he must have gotten careless, flew too close, and they shot him down. When he disappeared, I had to clean up and stop these bastards. We were so close, we couldn't quit. Dylan's tone had softened. It was more like plea bargaining than righteous indignation. We couldn't sleep this one through, Dutch. You were the only guy I could trust. To invade a foreign country, illegally. Schaefer spoke, cold as a prosecutor, savouring the affront to international law. You lied, pal. That's all it comes down to. You stacked the odds and you set us up. You could have gotten every one of us killed. You could be rotting our asses off in tiger cages for the duration of this fucking conflict, and nobody would even know, except the White House. Gee, you think maybe him and Nancy'd remember us in their prayers, like when they're saying grace at dinner? And maybe there's a picture of Lincoln on the wall. He paused a moment, breathing heavy from the rage and feeling a dryness in his throat, like he'd give his right thumb for a Carta Blanca. With huge contempt, he spat out the next words. You used to be one of us, Dylan. I think maybe we were drinking buddies too. But I must have been really in the bag, because I mixed you up with this guy who saved my ass once. I don't know who the fuck you are. No one was going to win this tennis match. The ball had been smashed to smithereens. We've been through a lot together, Dutch, Dylan replied quietly, still groping for a way to unplug Schaefer's rage. We were the best. But hey, things changed. We're fighting these Marxist wackos in a fucking dozen countries, and they're getting closer. This isn't the rice paddies anymore. We're 3 hours from Texas. We lose this fight, Dutch, and they start playing the game with buttons. We're all expendable assets, Major. Can't you see that? Schaefer snapped the document out of Dylan's hand. That's your problem, Dylan, he said. And I'll tell you something else. Your last stand for democracy and a quarter wouldn't buy me a fucking Hershey bar. What it's always about for you is getting ahead, isn't it? You gotta be the first black president, or else. Who cares about a bunch of off-the-wall commandos? They gotta die sometime, right? Well, listen good, dude. My men are not expendable, and we don't do this kind of work. Schaefer crumpled the paper in his fist. This is your dirty little war, not mine. Then he stuffed the wad into Dylan's shirt pocket and walked away. Dylan didn't move for a moment. He let the wad of paper sit in his breast pocket. He knew where he stood with Schaefer now. but in any case, there was no more time to waste. He bent to sift again through the papers,